Welcome! Today we are going to work on gessoing a wood panel. So starting out, I like to purchase these cradled wood panels that come from Trekell. They're based out of the United States. I do choose to get the solid wood panels instead of the hardboard top. It's just a personal preference of mine. So the first step is that the panel needs to be primed. I use this Golden brand GAC 100, and that's going to seal the wood surface and prevent the tannins in the wood leaking through and damaging my painting at a later point in time. I always shake the bottle first, and just in case it does have some separation in it, I'm not quite sure, so I just proceed on the side of error and go ahead and shake it first. I apply a pretty liberal amount, and then I use these just foam disposable brushes to apply the primer. I do have a little side note is that I prefer to not use so many single-use items. I do actually cut the tips off of these and reuse them a second time. But if anybody has any suggestions on a better way to apply this primer, I would love to hear your recommendations. So I apply a fairly thin coat of this primer and just make sure that it's covered all over the entire board. I want to make sure that when I pick it up and hold it to the light that I don't see any raw spots of the wood peeking through. It kind of has a little sheen to it. So again, a thin layer with this GAC 100. This primes the wood and protects it for when you put the gesso on top to prevent any kinds of issues later on in the life of your painting. Okay, this is the gesso that I use. It's Michael Harding's. It's a non-absorbent acrylic primer. So now my next step is going through, I primed this. I'm gonna go through with a fine sandpaper. I use a wet dry sandpaper, it's 600 grit. And I'm just gonna lightly scuff the surface to just clean up some of that primer. Because right now there's it's kind of a rough tooth to it. I don't like that much tooth to my paintings, so I'm gonna sand that down and then apply a layer of gesso. Now that I have it sanded down, I do go ahead and decide to apply a second coat of the primer. This isn't always necessary, but in this case, I think I sanded down a bit too much and my surface just didn't feel as smooth as I would like it to feel. So now that I have a smooth surface, I am moving on to my next step, which is applying the gesso. So we talked about, that was the Michael Harding non-acrylic primer, and I always tape the sides of my canvas to just make sure that I don't get too sloppy and have a bunch of gesso on the edges of my raw panel. And then I use an old rewards card and I use that to apply it. I'm sure there's spatulas and stuff that I could purchase, but this is just something that I already have and it works fine enough. I apply a really thin layer to start with. I want this layer to dry really quickly, and I also don't want to put too much gesso on there that it's going to have a lot of texture. So again, this is a personal preference of mine. I like a really smooth surface to paint on, while other artists prefer more texture. So definitely apply your gesso how you would like to have more texture or no texture on your canvas. And then I go through and I use that wet dry sandpaper we talked about, and it's a 600 grit, and this is after it's dried, I sand it down and just get any kind of rough parts of the gesso that I can feel. I don't want to feel dips or raises in the gesso layer and before I put a second coat on. Once I've sanded it, I go ahead and proceed with my second coat. I usually pull the gesso out of the lid because I shake it up before I use it, so anything that's in the lid, I just grab that. I try to just be as conservative as I can with my products that I'm using. When I apply my second layer, I turn the board to the side because I want to apply it in the opposite direction of what I did the first time. And this is just dropping it into any more wood grain that didn't fall into it in that first pass. Second coat is dry. It is time to go through and sand this down. So again, I'm doing the same thing. I just want to sand it down, make sure that it feels really smooth to touch. Again, this is my personal preference. I don't like to see a lot of grooves in the painting. I tend to paint very smoothly with my oil paints, and so I really want a smooth surface to paint onto. So I just go through, sand it, I remove my tape, and I'm all ready to go. Now, I have done before, I've done more layers of gesso. I am really just kind of getting that surface set up so I can paint on it, so I don't really worry too much about building up a bunch of layers of gesso. All right, and here's our completed product. It didn't take too long to do. It took about half of a day, so it's definitely a doable day project. Thank you for hanging out with me today. I really appreciate your support. Please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and definitely hang around for more.